Good evening. As we were explaining to several people this afternoon, Mr. Major is not the first Prime Minister of Britain to appear at DePauw. In fact, he is the fourth. Harold Macmillan has been a guest of DePauw, Harold Wilson, and Margaret Thatcher. And each time many of us come to this auditorium for an Ubben lecture, we surely must think how indebted we are to Tim and Sharon Ubben for endowing this lectureship. If one wonders how fortunate the students and faculty and citizens of DePauw are, you just might reflect on what is going on in this world, and that in just the past few years, Ubben lectures have featured Margaret Thatcher, Benazir Bhutto of Pakistan, and of course Shimon Peres of Israel. We are indeed indebted to the Ubbens, and this is certainly true this evening as we welcome the Honorable John Major, the former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Mr. Major was born in a working-class neighborhood in southern London and raised in a two-room apartment. Said he, "It has been of immense value to me to have been on the other side of the fence and know what it's like to face difficulties. I do not regret any of that." Mr. Major first became involved in politics at the age of 16 when he joined the Young Conservatives. In 1968, at the age of 25, he won his first election. In Parliament, Mr. Major served the government for 16 years, and he was in the cabinet for 10 years. He served as Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Foreign Secretary, and then Chancellor of the Exchequer, the powerful position from which he became Prime Minister in 1990, when he fought and won the campaign to succeed Margaret Thatcher. When he moved into 10 Downing Street, he faced a weakened party, economic recession, violence in Northern Ireland, and the likelihood of war in the Persian Gulf. He continued the United Kingdom's strong ties to the United States, and he gave full support to President Bush in the Persian Gulf in 1991. In fact, the British commitment to the Gulf War was second in size only to the United States. Out of office, Mr. Major has continued to work with Tony Blair. I'm sorry. Perhaps I should ad-lib and say, perhaps you would like Mr. Blair to come here soon as a former Prime Minister. But since he has been out of office, Mr. Major has worked with Tony Blair to secure peace in Northern Ireland. On New Year's Day in 1999, he was awarded one of the United Kingdom's greatest honors, the Companion of Honor, bestowed upon him by Queen Elizabeth in recognition of his initiative of the Northern Ireland peace process. An ABC News biography of John Major states, "It was on his watch that Britain's economy improved and became the envy of continental Europe. Unemployment went down and production went up. When he left office in 1997, London's Daily Telegraph observed that, quote, John Major leaves a richer legacy than any of his predecessors." Having been so personally involved in the Gulf War and in Northern Ireland, he certainly possesses significant insight into the post-September 11 world in which we all live. He has been gracious with his time, working with a class this afternoon, hosting a press conference, and now speaking to us in this Ubben lecture on the topic, This Changing World. Mr. Major, DePauw University welcomes you to our campus.
I hadn't realized I was the fourth British Prime Minister to come here, but then we are 10 a penny. And I don't want, President, you to worry a moment about confusing me with Tony Blair. It's entirely understandable. He stole most of my policies. I'm entirely happy with that. And I'm delighted to be here this evening as part of the Timothy and Sharon Ubben lecture series. It's a very great privilege to join you at this university tonight. Now, over the last few weeks, I guess most of our minds have been focused on the wicked attacks on New York and Washington and what must come after them. They're a stark testimony to the power of hate and envy and the very worst of human nature. And yet those attacks brought out the best of human nature as well, in the bravery of individuals, in the courage of the rescue workers, in the response especially of New Yorkers, in the rallying of support for the United States from all around the world. God Bless America was on the lips of many people who are not American in the immediate aftermath of that attack. And it is, I think, reassuring, comforting even, that an act of such evil can bring forth so much that is good. Now, at the time of those attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, the world economy was already slowing, in some cases quite dramatically. But the assault on America has thrown that into very sharp relief. And that economic situation is by no means the best backcloth for the wide range of policy changes that will have to accompany the action that is now being taken against terrorism. Let me focus on that backcloth for just a moment. We have today the weakest economic growth around the world that we have seen for 50 years, with very probably in the next few months an absolute contraction in world trade as a whole. We face a probable, perhaps certain recession in the United States and a short recession in the whole of the global economy. Now, we haven't seen anything like this for 50 years. But on this occasion, not only is the United States going into recession, but so is Japan and so is Asia. And in past Western recessions, when we've had a recession here in the West, we've been able to rely on around 4% growth in Japan and 7% growth in Asia in order to keep the world economy moving along. But that isn't going to happen on this occasion. And that, of course, is the bad economic news. The better news, subject to one caveat, is that the coordination of economic policy around the world in this new global economy that we have has been better over the last 2 months than I can ever remember on any previous occasion when the world's economy faced difficulties. Secondly, the recession here in the United States is probably going to be relatively shallow, with a probable recovery sometime in the middle of next year. There's a caveat to that, and that caveat is crucial: the future of energy prices generally and oil prices in particular. If they remain at broadly their present level, it will be all right. But if oil prices were to rise dramatically, then of course that economic outlook would worsen very sharply. But it isn't the economy that most of us are most concentrating on at the moment. The world now faces a new preoccupation, a commitment to fight global terrorism, not just bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, against whom attacks have now been underway for 3 weeks, but global terrorism. And only now, I think, are people generally beginning to realize and accept the sheer scale of what must now lie ahead. Because that attack in New York and Washington set in train events unlike any we have ever seen before, and for policymakers set questions they have never previously had to consider. The atrocity in early September highlights a growing problem. Terrorism around the world has worsened over the last 20 years. And terrorism isn't a nation. Terrorism is Al-Qaeda, it's Hezbollah, it's ETA, it's the IRA, it's Hamas, it's the Tamil Tigers, it's the Kashmiri separatists, the Punjabi separatists. It's any number of tiny Middle Eastern and in many cases Latin American groups as well. Groups that are hidden, secretive, diverse. To understand the mentality of the terrorist is not easy for most people. And for that reason, let me focus for a few minutes on the experience that we have had in the United Kingdom of terrorism. We have lived in Britain with the fear of terrorism for 20 or 30 years from the Irish Republican Army. They have tried to murder 2 British prime ministers and their cabinets. You mentioned, Mr. President, Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher was in a hotel in Brighton in England, from which I had myself only just departed 2 hours earlier, when an IRA bomb exploded, causing death and the total destruction of that hotel. The intention was to kill Margaret and most of the cabinet, and it did kill people. The room in which I was staying was totally obliterated, and the people in the room next to me, one was crippled and the other severely damaged. And then a few years later, when I was Prime Minister, the IRA tried again. Whilst I was chairing a cabinet, a war Gulf cabinet, in 1991. Downing Street itself came under missile attack, missiles which missed the building by no further than I am from the second row of this auditorium. I was sitting there at the cabinet table, the missile landed, blew in all the reinforced windows, the reinforced curtains, and severely damaged Downing Street. A few feet closer, and the IRA would have been successful in their attempt to murder the British Prime Minister and the British cabinet. Not, of course, that such atrocities are restricted to politicians. In Britain, many hundreds of innocent lives have been lost on the UK mainland and in Northern Ireland as a result of IRA activities. Innocent men, women, children, who had no knowledge or part in the IRA's fight. And I learned from that. In the mind of the terrorist, no one, nowhere is immune. Not London's financial district, Canary Wharf, that was hit. Not shopping centres around the United Kingdom like Warrington, a town in the north of England, where on a sunny Easter Saturday morning, 2 young boys, aged 9 and 11, left home to go and buy Easter eggs for their parents. They never returned. Their tiny bodies literally blown to pieces by a bomb left in a bin in that market to make a political point and murder innocent passers-by. So that is the terrorism that Britain has learned to live with over the last 20 or 30 years. And that is why you need never doubt in the United States for 1 second that Britain will remain with the United States every step of this battle that you have now entered into, from the very first moment to the very last moment. We have experience of what you face, and we know there comes a time when you have to confront it. Now, to us, gathered here this evening, the behavior of terrorists, their disregard for human life, seems unimaginable. Soon after the events, those terrible events of September the 11th, the IRA sought to distance themselves from this particular act of evil. And this is what they said, or their spokesman said: "At least we give warnings." Apart from the fact that that wasn't always true, it could have been little comfort to the parents of those little boys in Warrington, little comfort to those who were slaughtered or bereaved by their own terrorist campaigns. Now, thankfully, after a long period of negotiation and consideration and preparation, it may be that this IRA action may finally be coming to an end. It is possible to end terrorism. And at this moment of all moments, America must cling to that truth. Now, all terrorists have a cause, and to them that cause comes first. An innocent life often comes some way behind that cause. They are often fanatics. I have no regrets. I acted alone and on the orders of God. Thus the extremist who murdered Yitzhak Rabin, the Israeli prime minister, and wholly derailed, wrecked the Middle East peace process, with how many lives subsequently lost. Now, the most immediate focus of this campaign is bin Laden's group Al-Qaeda, which has formed. When American embassies were attacked and American lives lost in Africa, that was Al-Qaeda. When the USS Cole was attacked in the Yemen and 17 American servicemen died, that was Al-Qaeda. When New York and Washington was attacked, that was Al-Qaeda. As this action against terrorism goes on, it will become more controversial, and it is therefore worth taking a few moments to consider whether there were alternatives to what is now happening. For here is the dilemma faced by the policymakers. After that attack, they had three choices. They could ignore the attack and hope the terrorists would go away, but they wouldn't. They could ignore it and hope they might hit somebody else next, which they might have done. Or they could confront it, which is beset with uncertainties and difficulties on an immense scale. But the very immensity of that atrocity in New York and Washington truly gave no choice. It is vital for democracy to confront terrorism, because the threat may grow enormously if it does not. Those attacks set a new landmark. Future attacks could be even more audacious and frightening without a response. I don't, for example, know whether these anthrax scares that have so captured the attention in the United States are connected. Very possibly not directly. But undoubtedly some terrorist groups have access to biochemical weapons. But then comes the second question. If you have to consult this, and you have, the second question leaps out at you, unbidden and unavoidable. How does one confront such an elusive enemy as terrorism? This isn't a war like Iraq, with fixed targets and a straightforward mission and a certainty of when it was over. It is very different. And we are now beginning to see the start of the answer. In the last few weeks, assets, men, boats, planes, equipment have been put in place. A coalition has been built, an extraordinary coalition involving much of the world, potentially hostile countries, hostile traditionally to the United States and the West. They have been squared. All this was necessary, and all this has been done. Now, the immediate target, is every semblance of Taliban military or communications installations. It is terrorist training camps. It is terrorist leaders and their followers. It is terrorist money. Now, these are precision targets. And the diplomacy of this war, the need to maintain a wide coalition of support, the need to reassure Islam, one of the oldest religions, that this is an action against terrorism, not against the beliefs of Islam. The need to assist the refugees and the innocent victims, of whom there may be hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of this campaign. All this requires the action to remain precise. This war must be won in the mind of public opinion around the world, as well as in the action zones. And this is a huge undertaking. The military action will be overwhelmingly American, with British support and perhaps from time to time with wider support as well. But the diplomacy, the financial targeting, the intelligence operation, the running to ground of the targets will be work that must be undertaken by a wide coalition. And many countries, some of whom will never admit it, have a stake in the success of this operation. Russia, for example. For years, the glue that held the West together, Russia was the enemy. The NATO bloc against the Warsaw bloc. America against Russia, the two superpowers. Russia is a tacit, perhaps better than tacit, ally in this campaign, because Russia fears Islamic fundamentalism. It fears it coming round the south of Russia, up through the Caucasus and into Russia, destabilizing those parts of Russia that have not already succeeded and become independent republics. So Russia is a tacit ally. And China. China is joined to Afghanistan in the northwest by a highway. On the first day, they blocked that highway with military hardware and large numbers of troops to stop the Afghanistan infection leaking into Russia and into China. Neither Russia nor China have objected. The dog that didn't bark, they have said nothing, no fuss at the United Nations, no formal notes, no objections. They are content for America and her allies to deal with this problem. And if they may not be active in their support, they are not going to be active in their opposition. And so there may be strange bedfellows in this action that is now being taken. The Shiite Iranians may well support the Northern Alliance because they loathe the Taliban. Of the 6 billion people on our planet, 6 billion who are Muslim, 90% are Sunni Muslims, 10% are Shiites. The Shiites are in Iraq, they're in Iran, and they're in the Northern Alliance opposing the Taliban. And so the Northern Alliance may have some very strange allies indeed as they seek to overthrow the Taliban. And many Arab states, themselves threatened by fundamentalist groups, may have occasional roles to play in this particular campaign. And we're now seeing something else. We're seeing the denunciation of terrorism from the most unlikely quarters. Some of it is a masterpiece of hypocrisy, but the very fact of it is a new ingredient in international diplomacy. So is the things that have not happened. So is the relative silence of Libya, of Syria, of Iran, of Iraq, where opposition has been voiced to what is now being done by America and her allies. It is largely ritual opposition from the governments. Now, none of this will have escaped the attention of terrorist organizations around the world, certainly not bin Laden and al-Qaeda. And so their tactic is the one that was always going to be their tactic from the first moment. They will try to turn this situation into the Western coalition led by America against Islam, not the Western coalition led by America against terrorists who may or may not be Islamic fundamentalists. Now, this ploy may seem absurd to us this evening. It may seem absurd to the well-informed. It may not be so absurd outside the mosques in the Middle East. It may not be so absurd in the bazaars in Muslim countries. It may not be so absurd in the streets of those countries. It may not seem so absurd to people who from their very childhood have been brought up listening, seeping through their very pores, anti-Western propaganda for all of their lives. It may not be so absurd to people who are dispossessed, who are hungry, who are ill-educated, who hear these voices of hate pouring out with their bile against the Western democracies. So bringing those people together and keeping them together will be a very remarkable feat to achieve. And it will get more difficult once the coalition moves beyond bin Laden and al-Qaeda. The Taliban may soon be forced from power. But catching bin Laden may not be so easy. Consider the options. Consider the first option, that he stays at liberty. If he stays at liberty, he may become even more of a folk hero to those Muslims wishing to follow him, who see him thumbing his nose at the most powerful nation on this earth. And if we kill him, he becomes a martyr, and truth may be sacrificed to legend. And then the third option is that we catch him and we put him on trial. But where do we put him on trial? The problem over Lockerbie took years to resolve. If he stands trial, that will be a lengthy process in the United States. Will we be able to produce a jury that is dispassionate? What outrages may be perpetrated to release him during his period of captivity? Who may be kidnapped or killed? What may be destroyed? How powerful a rallying cry to millions of dispossessed people in Islam would it be to have him on trial in the West? Now, these are practical problems that the American administration and their allies need to confront. And the very diversity of this coalition, its very spread around the world, has problems. How do you keep it together? What is the price of keeping it together? Many of the peripheral members of this coalition will have difficult domestic audiences in their own countries. They must be kept on board. Their sensitivities need to be acknowledged. So there will be an economic, a military, and a political price to be paid by the West for the support that it seeks. In short, support of the Third World for the coalition will lead to demands for support from the coalition for the Third World, and we do not yet know in what form those demands will come. And then there is another problem that we will not be blind to and dare not be blind to. There is a refugee problem potentially growing beyond our imagination. Even before September the 11th, something between 2 million and 4 million refugees had fled Afghanistan. Huge numbers more will also follow. It will be difficult and costly to help them, but they have nothing. No food, no clothing, no shelter, no opportunity, no future. And we could not, nor would we wish, to turn our backs on them. To help them, there is no choice. We must. And most of them will be the innocent victims of terrorism, impoverished people, among the most wretched people in the world, made yet more wretched by the repression of the Taliban and the consequences of living under their rule. But for us, despite that acceleration of the refugee problem, there can be no choice about confronting terrorism. If not now, when? If never, what chaos problems? Are we, in our generation, to leave it to the next generation to face an even worse problem than exists today? Or despite the difficulties, do we have an obligation in our generation to try and clear the way so the next generation faces no such problem and can begin to tackle their own lives, their own futures, and the other problems that exist around the world without that evil cast that has hit so much of the world at present? We are embarked upon a long campaign. This isn't a week, a month, or even a year. We are embarked on a long campaign against an evil that scars our lives and will take years and not months to complete. It will be a diplomatic, military, and economic campaign. It will be won, but it will never be possible to find a day upon which you can claim absolute victory. Now, all that may seem to you very gloomy, but I don't think you should be too gloomy, for one day this was a problem we had to face. It happens to have come in our time and at our moment, and it is right for our leaders and our countries to face it. And if it seems a little gloomy to you, the prospects, let me say that this battle will be won. And let me now turn to one or two other matters on a rather lighter note. I left politics last June. The British general election, I decided not to contest my seat, and I am now a free man. I can say what I think, how I think, when I think it, exactly in the way I think it. And it is very liberating. One of the delights of leaving politics is one discovers there is rather an enjoyable world outside. Although there are moments of nostalgia for the old game. Now, certainly the verbal exchanges outside politics, or at least, as a guest in your country, I'd better say, outside British politics, are far less crisp than within British politics. Now, robust exchanges in British politics, you're all very polite in America, robust exchanges in British politics are a very old tradition, as the first lady member of the House of Commons discovered. Now, you may be surprised to know that the first lady member of the British House of Commons was an American lady, Nancy Astor, who was married to a minor British aristocrat and was the Conservative Member of Parliament for a West Country seat. And she caused a huge furore when she got in the House of Commons. Nobody knew this wonderful male club that existed for 500-odd years, and suddenly this rather sparky, opinionated American lady began to shake it up and down a bit. And nobody much liked that, except her, who rather enjoyed herself. And she had been in the House of Commons about 2 months. And she was speaking in the House of Commons on agriculture, a constituency interest. And you may have seen on C-SPAN the gentle nature of British politics. And she was speaking about agriculture, standing up in the House of Commons, and suddenly, in the tradition of our House, she was interrupted by a political opponent who said to her, "You know nothing about agriculture. How many toes has a pig?" Without pausing, she said, "How many toes has a pig? Take off your boots and count." Now, Nancy Astor was a great friend of the great Winston Churchill. Now, Churchill was a Victorian man. He didn't, in truth, he didn't approve of Nancy Astor being in the House of Commons. But they had the sort of friendship you sometimes see. Anybody attacked Churchill, Nancy would defend him. Anybody attacked Nancy, Churchill would defend her. But when they were together, they fought like ferrets in a sack. Now, Churchill was a very great man, but he had one or two foibles. He used to like, late at night, 1 or 2 brandies, or perhaps even 3 or 4. And I want you to picture the scene. It is 1 o'clock in the morning because the House of Commons sits crazy hours. A little mental instability is a good backcloth for a politician. It sits odd hours. And 1 o'clock in the morning, the great Churchill, several brandies on board, is weaving ever so slightly down the green baize corridors of the House of Commons. And he gets to one end of one corridor and he turns into another green baize corridor. And there, smack in front of him, is Nancy Astor. And she looks him up and down. And she says, "Winston, you're drunk." And he looks her up and down and he says, "Nancy, you're ugly." But I at least will be sober in the morning. Absolutely no wonder that she said to him on one occasion, "Winston, if I was married to you, I'd put poison in your coffee." He said, "Nancy, if you were married to me, I'd drink it." Now, I shall miss all that and those exchanges, but the loss will not be unbearable. Now, I look at politics these days through the eyes of someone who was at the center and is no longer. And as I do, there is much in politics around the world that I don't much care for. I remain an advocate of politics as public service. And thankfully, there are still many men and women who seek election in politics because they see it as a vocation. They are eager to serve the common good. And yet, despite that, the relentless toll of negative politics, of negative reporting of daily sensations, too often presents an unbalanced and almost always unflattering view of public life. And sometimes some aspects of modern politics help feed that cynicism. Too often in the last decade, policy has been the child of a sound bite, a memorable phrase that seems to offer a simple solution to a complex problem. And yet if it's simple, it isn't a problem. And if it is a problem, it can't be solved by a sound bite. In our complex world, simplicities are dangerous and sound bites are a fraud. Now, I have been in politics for pretty nearly 40 years. And in the whole of that time, I've only heard one worthwhile soundbite. And I will share it with you. It was Boris Yeltsin, before lunch, at the Kremlin. And we were talking about Russia. And I said, tell me, Boris, in one word, what is the state of Russia? He said, good. I was surprised it was falling to pieces. I said, Boris, give me the longer version in 2 words. He said, not good. And I realized that the short-term answer is often the wrong one. Very remarkable man, Yeltsin. He came to stay with me at Chequers on one occasion, and we'd been working for 2 or 3 days. Chequers is the British Prime Minister's Camp David. And we'd been working for 2 or 3 days, and it was Friday lunchtime. We'd been working all morning. And I said, Boris, we've done extremely well. How do you feel about a walk? And he said he thought that was a good idea. Chequers sits in hundreds of acres of lovely British countryside. And he went upstairs, and he came down a few moments later in an electric blue tracksuit and trainers. And we went out for a walk. Boris, Naina Yeltsin, myself, my wife Norma, 30 or 40 diplomats, 40 or 50 protection officers. The sort of everyday walk that heads of government have. And we hadn't gone above 300 yards when it became apparent that Boris Yeltsin was not one of the great walkers of our time. And we went on for a while, and we stood on the brow of a hill. And I said, Boris, you've 3 choices. You can walk all the way back to Chequers, it's about 2 miles. He said, brr. You can walk to the bottom of the hill, and we will be driven back. Brr. Or I said, over there, Boris, in the corner of that village, Boris, is the Bernard Arms, an old-fashioned English pub where we can get a drink. And this was the first time that Western intelligence learned that Boris Yeltsin had a few words of English. Gins and tonic, he said, gins and tonic. And off we went to the pub, this huge long crocodile following on behind. And we got to the pub. It was shut. Now, the president of Russia is not used to being shut out of anything. And one of his aides went to the pub on an English summer Friday, glorious summer day in England, right in the heart of the English countryside. One of Boris Yeltsin's aides went up, banging on the door of the pub. Open up, he yelled. It's the president of Russia. And a voice from inside the pub echoed out, "Oh yes, this is the Kaiser speaking." Which is apropos of absolutely nothing, but I remembered it when we talked of Russia. Now, it's easy to smile when politics is trivialized, but with respect, you shouldn't, because it's a very dangerous trend. Because if the last decade has taught us anything, it ought to have taught us we need properly joined up, thought through policy. We need to understand how one political event impacts upon another, and how if we treat them in isolation, we create problems. So this generation, more than any generation that preceded it, needs a global view of the changes that lie ahead. And let me just touch on one or two of them. Very soon, China, the most populous nation in the world, will join the World Trade Organization. Sometime this century, I don't know when it will be, but sometime this century, China will have the biggest economy in the world, bigger even than the United States. Now, China isn't El Dorado. Very few people will make instant killings if they go into China, but the prospects are extraordinary. Next year, the present leadership will go, and very possibly Hu Jintao will replace them. In many ways, rather an odd choice. He was the party secretary in Tibet, but he didn't often go to Tibet because he suffers from altitude sickness, and stayed at home and became the consensus choice of Chinese leaders. Now, he and the other new leaders of China, for they will have completely new leaders in 2 years' time, will inherit a China that has come a very long way, but has very far still to go. Their social security net is embryonic. There's a huge disparity in incomes between urban and rural areas. There's a massive imbalance between the development of their seaboard and the development of inland areas. There is in China a pervasive corruption, despite harsh penalties. And human rights are not improving, despite a growing ferment about political reform. And yet, China is awakening and stepping out into our world, and will change it. There is an interesting counterpoint between China and Russia. China embarked on economic reform, followed by political reform. Russia opted for political reform, followed by economic reform. And the results so far in our mercenary world suggest China chose more wisely. As for Russia, Russia is still adapting to her loss of an empire. Now, we British understand that. The UK had 50 years between the loss of India and the loss of Hong Kong, or if you wish, 220 years between the loss of Hong Kong and a little setback in Boston Harbor. Though we regard that as only the beginning of a return engagement. As for Russia, they had only 3 years between the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union. And adjustment is hideously difficult. Russia cannot reconstitute her empire. She is Humpty Dumpty, and she cannot be put together again. Mr. Putin, the president of Russia, is an enigma to many people in the West. His heart is with the Soviet Union. He wants to restore order, strength, pride to Russia. He is suspicious of Western motives. He infringes press freedom and human rights. He has yet to understand that a strong state and the rule of law are different things. And Russia, being what she is, leaders always put order before law. And yet, Putin knows strength for Russia requires prosperity. It requires a market economy. It requires integration into the world market. And whereas Boris Yeltsin polarized Russia, you were a reformer or you were not a reformer, Putin is drawing it together and appealing to the middle ground. Putin strikes deals. He strikes deals with Zyuganov's communists, with Primakov, who gets jobs, with Lushkov, who gets influence, with Nemtsov, who gets access, and even with the liberal Yavlinsky, who gets to be heard, even if he also gets to be ignored. And meanwhile, Russian companies are learning that it is more profitable to invest than to steal. Now, there are long-term economic problems there, but these very deficiencies are creating huge opportunities. The prospect of making real money is bringing back investors. Russia isn't risk-free. Russian companies can be held to work with, but success can bring huge rewards. And the Russia of 10 years ago is a different beast from the Russia of today. And the Russia of 10 years hence will be yet another different beast entirely. And then there is Europe. Again, an enigma for many people. Why is it changing so much these days, Europe? And what does that mean for America and for the rest of the world? Much of the answer about what is happening in Europe lies 50 years ago. If you wish to understand your future, it is worthwhile acknowledging your past. In 2 world wars, in 1945, 1946, Europe was smashed from within. Germany, the largest and most powerful single country in Europe, was bankrupt and divided. Much of Europe was a wasteland. Historical nations, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, were the wrong side of the Iron Curtain and about to be subjected to 50 years of communist rule. Britain, who entered the 20th century with the most powerful, richest empire the world had ever seen, 46 years later, was nearly bankrupt and with her empire gone or about to go. That was only 50-odd years ago, within the lifespan of millions and millions of people in Britain and in the United States and even more in Europe. And at that time, around the late 40s, 1950, far-sighted Europeans looked around the world and they saw the huge power of Soviet Russia at one end of Europe. They saw the dominance of the United States across the Atlantic, and they foresaw the rise of China, of Japan, and of Asia. And they feared, those mid-century Europeans, that they would become political pygmies in a world of political giants. And it was that concern that enabled leaders of nation-states in Europe to make political sacrifices of power and national self-identity that would have been unthinkable to their predecessors. They surrendered power at the level of the nation-state to build up power at the pan-European level. And as a result, integration across Europe has moved forward relentlessly. Now Europe has a new currency, the euro, which will issue its notes and coins across the Eurozone in a few weeks' time. And the euro is big. It's bigger than the pound sterling and it's bigger than the yen. It is second in size only to the United States dollar. And the Europeans look forward and they see the euro as a future rival for the dollar. One can mock that concept today, but I would not mock it too loudly if I were you. For the European Union has massive gold and foreign exchange reserves, and Europe has collectively an economy that is already a little larger than that of the United States. And if over time the euro does become an alternative safe haven, the dollar would not be able to defy economic gravity with the impunity it has shown in the past. And then there are other changes that will affect our world. Let me take a longer look for a moment than the analysts, and inevitably, therefore, one that is less certain. 5 countries, all at present in difficulties, will illustrate my point. Russia, Indonesia, China, India, and Brazil. Those 5 countries have between them 1/2 of the labor force of the entire world. 1/2 of the labor force, 1/11 of the output. Now that will change. Change with organic growth, change with the nature of the world economy. In 25 years, they may double their share of world trade, not double the amount they've got, but their share of enhanced world trade. And to see what that means, At the moment, those 5 countries have 1/3 of the share of world trade that the European Union has. 1/3. In 25 years' time, they will not have 1/3 of the share of world trade that the European Union has. They will have 1.5 times as much of a share of world trade as the European Union has. And the students leaving college in the next 2 or 3 years will be living in a world wholly different from the one in which they can see as they look around the world today. It is against these enormous changes in the world that we need what I call grown-up politics. The events of September the 11th are about to give us all a masterclass in consequences. We need politics that confronts the uncomfortable, politics that rises above the short-term and the soundbite, politics that is long-term and that understands that it no longer controls all the pieces on the checkerboard, politics that injects common sense and rejects common abuse, politics that is directed at issues as opposed to personalities. We need joined-up, common-sense politics. Let me conclude by reading you a poem that you may know and that I learned as a small boy. For the want of a nail, the shoe was lost. For the want of a shoe, the horse was lost. For the want of a horse, the rider was lost. For the want of a rider, the message was lost. For the want of a message, the battle was lost. For the want of a battle, the war was lost. For the want of a war, the kingdom was lost. And all for the want of a horseshoe nail. That was written by Benjamin Franklin in 1758. It is the classic illustration of how a whole chain of events can be triggered by a single incident. If it was true in the world of Benjamin Franklin, it is even more true today, and we would be wise to understand it. Thank you very much.
Well, not even in Greencastle, Indiana, do we often have the opportunity to spend the evening with a prime minister. And he has graciously agreed to stay a few more minutes and answer any questions our students or faculty might have. There's a microphone in this aisle, there's a microphone in this aisle. And so if you have a question, you might form a line. I'm going to say a short line. Because his time is limited. And people are already coming. I might ask you the first question. You mentioned the cynicism that perhaps young people have about politics. You talked about grown-up politics, and you talk about the role the press has played in all this. From your perspective, as now retired from public life, political life, would you comment on the role and the proper role of the press, and maybe say just a word or two from your perspective about the difference between the American press and the British press?
Let me say something about press relationships generally. I don't think it's flippant to say that the best relationship between politicians and the press should be one of constructive disagreement. To have a press lamely following whatever the administration or the government of a particular country says is rather pointless. To have them opposing for the sake of opposition is equally pointless. I don't like to see a press that is too partisan, too committed to a particular view, a particular politician, or a particular party. But I do think it is valuable when the press can raise subjects that sometimes are taboo amongst the fashionable thinkers in politics and around it. That is the best of the press. The first point about the press, it has always seemed to me, their first job is to report the news rather than comment upon the news. But the point of commenting, yes, it is rare, but it's a very good idea. And the point about comment, it should add something. I do think there is a tendency, and I think it is less so in America. You may think you've got a tough press in America. You go and ask the British or the Australians whether you've got a tough press in America, and they would say your press is unbelievably well behaved. Travel later and you'll see what I mean. I think the best of the press does offer constructive thoughts, does point the way ahead, does often publicize things that may be uncomfortable for an administration but actually deserve airing. The press is at its worst when it gets at its most partisan and where it gets, largely because it is seeking, I think, to enhance its coverage, it gets into the realms of personality politics and perhaps particular attacks on political personalities. I think that is when the press is at its worst. But the press at its best is an important cornerstone of the Constitution. It is sometimes at its best, but sadly, not always. Yes, shall we take the first question?
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. As you are no doubt aware, there's a growing controversy in this country about the initial governmental responses in this country to deal with terrorism and our counterterrorism legislation, particularly with regard to civil liberties. Given your unique experience and perhaps even that of your predecessor, what could you tell us about the unique difficulties that democracies face in fighting terrorism? Must we sacrifice some of our most cherished traditions and beliefs, in particular civil liberties, in our fight in this current crisis? Thank you.
The definition of civil liberties is often a difficult one. If you mean the fundamental civil liberties, then I don't think they need be at risk, and I don't think they should be at risk. I think some things that are convenient for citizens may at a time of crisis for the greater good become inconvenient. And I suppose they are civil liberties too. So I can see that at the fringes there may be some dangers to civil liberties, but I don't think fundamentally there should be or there need be as a result of what has happened recently. Minor civil liberties, very probably so in the short term until we get our balance and find out exactly what we're dealing with.
Why is it that when we look at the breeding ground that has produced these acts, we refer to things like hate and envy only, which certainly I'm sure that there are some emotions like that do drive these things. Why not talk about political grievances? When the IRA does something, when it murders innocent children, everyone condemns the act, but nevertheless the discussions that follow do discuss some of the wider political factors that may have motivated these people. Why not talk about issues that moderate observers around the international community, not only in the Muslim world, refer to as factors, the ongoing repression of civil society and independent critiques in repressive governments throughout the Middle East, the sanctions on Iraq that have resulted in the destruction of the civil society, of the civilian infrastructure, and the deaths of many children, the uneven approach to the conflict in Palestine, that uneven approach that has been followed by many Western governments, and also the presence of American troops in places which have aroused a set of resentment and a view of Americans as being occupiers.
Well, let me take some of those points. If I take the Irish point first, and the suggestion that the Irish Republican Army has grievances against the British and therefore it is legitimate to have a terrorist attack to create a united Ireland. That is generally, I think, a fair description of the way they have presented their case over the past 50 years. If that is so, that they are fighting for a united Ireland against the wicked British, why is it that the British government and the Irish government are united in the peace process against the IRA? It can't surely be that the Irish government had been suborned by the British. And so it is a perversion of what the truth is, their case. Some people wish to have a united Ireland. Others do not. Many, and the majority of people in the north of Ireland do not. Others have an aspiration. But no political aspiration of that sort justifies the sort of attacks that they have engaged in for 50 years against both the wishes of the Irish government, successive Irish governments of all Irish political parties, and successive British governments. So I think it is a perversion. And often in history, the perverted but simple tale comes to be the one that people hear rather than the more complex reality. And then the second case you put was the question of sanctions on Iraq. And of course, there is huge hardship in Iraq. But in 1992, immediately after the Iraq War, a motion was passed, prompted, I think, by Britain and America, that gave Saddam Hussein the right to sell outside the normal restrictions oil in vast amounts, provided the resources and product of that sale was used for food and medicine for the people of Iraq. He has had the opportunity to do that for the last 9 years. He has chosen not to do that so that he can point to the hardship of his own people and say that is the fault of the Americans and the British and the international community. And again, it is a perversion. It is a quarter truth turned into a whole truth and distorted. Insofar as some of the other points are concerned, I mentioned some illustrations. I mentioned resentment. I mentioned envy. I could also have mentioned fear. I do believe it is the case, and I think here you are onto a good point, that if we are permanently going to sustain a position in which terrorism does not find an echo in the hearts and minds of people in countries around the world, then we are going to have to address, as a world, as rich nations, America, Britain, Japan, France, Germany, the European Union, rest of the European Union, we rich nations are going to have to address the economic ills of poorer nations much more constructively than ever we have done in the past. If we wish to stop the hatred screamed outside the mosques on Friday from finding an echo in the hearts of the ill-educated people passing by, then we had better show them the other side of our democracies, not the power, not the riches which they see on television and envy, but the instinct to help other people and create a better world. And that is going to cost us dollars and pounds and euros and yen, and we will have to spend them. And I think that the need for that is being shown more clearly day after day as we move into this battle against terrorism. And there I think you are onto a good point. Yes.
Yes, thank you. President Bush has said on many occasions that he wishes to root out terrorism wherever it may lie in the world, and you spoke to this earlier in your speech. But what role do you see America really playing in ending terrorism in Northern Ireland? And what role do you believe America should play given its vast Irish-American political and economic support of actions in that country?
Well, American administrations have been very supportive to the British government over Ireland over a long period. George Bush was. I can speak of the years I was in government. George Bush was, and Bill Clinton was. They both took a direct interest in the Northern Irish negotiations. I kept them very much up to date, and on many occasions they were very supportive. So I think there has been an enormous amount of support. I think what has happened, what has brought the IRA to disarmament is three things. The lengthy peace process, which I started 10 years ago, which Labour supported, Tony Blair continued it, I supported him. That has put the IRA, many of the political problems they faced have gone, and there is now a democratic process in Northern Ireland of which Sinn Féin are a part. That is the first ingredient. The second is the embarrassment of the IRA at being caught in Colombia in the way they were. And the third is the recognition of the IRA that after what happened in New York, terrorism is not acceptable in any form to people around the world. It brought it home, those televisual pictures, those awful pictures, brought what terrorism actually is around the world home to people in a way I think nothing previously had done. And I think a combination of those three things helped those people within the IRA who wished to bring the matter to a conclusion, of which there are many, gave them the extra push, the extra majority to defeat those in the IRA who wish to continue going on in the old way. So I think, if we are lucky, and I pray that we are, I think we are probably seeing pretty much the end of the IRA as a military force engaged in terrorism, and the beginning of a new chapter for Northern Ireland, and I hope that proves to be true. Yes.
Former Prime Minister Major, in our American government class, we talked about the relatively short terms of American politicians compared to other ones around the world. I was wondering what you thought about that, and if you think anything should be done to lengthen the terms so that politicians can be more focused on what you talked about, politicking for the common good.
I've often thought about that. I think on balance not. I mean, having served in government for 7 years in a large democratic Western state, I think the pressures of doing it for a long time are intense. And I think there does come a period, 7, 8 years or so, when it is probably time for a fresh mind to move in and to take over. The pressures are different in many of the autocratic states that have a single ruler for 25 years. They have their domestic pressures, but they don't have the international pressures that would be faced by the President of the United States, Prime Minister of Britain, President of France, or Chancellor of Germany. So I think on balance, my personal view is that 7 or 8 years is enough. I think after that there is a danger of staleness and tiredness unless you are a truly exceptional human being. And it is probably better. I think the statute of limitations on the period you can serve is probably right. Whether 4 years or 5 years is right per term, or 7 years, or one single term of 7 years as the French have, or they have 2 terms of 7 years for their president, that is a moot point. I think it would depend on the individual system and tradition. But I don't think politicians should go on for too long. Okay, I'm told we can take one more, and I think it's yours, sir.
All right, maybe.
Well, gosh, no pressure. Thank you for joining us tonight, Mr. Major.
Thank you.
I actually wanted to ask you, you commented earlier on searching for the global view in a time like now. Of course, coming out of the European Union and everything, I wanted to ask you what your view was on the importance of national identity in establishing civic responsibility in a time like now.
I think it's very important. I mean, one of the things that I am a quarter American. So my father was brought up in America, was brought up in Pennsylvania, and taught me to love this country from a very small age. So I hope, being American, I can say nice things about it and also criticize it, being a quarter American. But here, here I just wish to praise it unreservedly, because if you go around America, you will find in the greatest houses and the most humble houses, you will find the American flag flying by people who are proud to be American, many of whom came from around the world, the huddled masses, who came from around the world in the most cosmopolitan society the world has ever seen, who came to America, who made a home here, who loved this country, who may have gained a great deal from it, or very little in some cases. But they still are proud, they still fly the American flag. Now, I know of no country in Europe or elsewhere in the world that, amongst the mature democracies, that has that same degree of national self-pride. And I find that very attractive. Now, whether that is that America is a very young nation, I mean, you are pretty young, a couple of 100 years or so. Most of the European nations were nations 1,000, 2,000 years ago. Other nations were nations 5,000 years ago. Maybe they've become more blasé. But I think you have a national self-identity and patriotism that doesn't turn beyond patriotism to a loathing of foreigners, that I find enormously attractive. And I think it's one of the aspects of America that I most admire and that I think you should most cherish. Thank you all very much. I'll leave those there. Thank you. Can I sit down or go up?